one.
So good afternoon, everyone. We are really happy you're with us. My name is Virginia Mewborn, and I'm the Division Disaster Director in Southeastern Caribbean, and I will be your moderator for this call. We are super excited to have Brad Kieserman as our speaker today. But before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to Becky McCory, the Division Disaster Executive, for some opening comments. Becky?
Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Thursday. I just want to say a special shout out to all of the members of SECAR² because this has been a very busy week thus far, and I think we're going to have a very busy weekend coming. This tropical storm has presented challenges, and our colleagues down in USVI and Puerto Rico are seeing significant rain and wind, but I did get most recent update from USVI that basically said they think they're back to steady state this afternoon, which is great news. I just want to say to everybody, leaning in and being prepared for Cat 1, Cat 2 is what we do most of the season. And you couldn't make me any prouder of all the readiness work that's been done thus far. And we have a few more months to go through the same exercise. And one of these times we absolutely will get hit with a bigger one. So this could be a trial run. Hopefully most of our regions going up the coast to include into Central Atlantic will not have significant impact, but I just want to say on behalf of SECAR², thanks to all the NHQ staff who've been very supportive. Thank you to all of your volunteers for stepping up and your willingness to respond to this tropical storm. But most importantly, thank you to you and your families for sharing your time, because we will be taking some of your time this weekend. That said, I welcome the Vice President of Operations and Logistics, Brad Kieserman, to take time out of his busy schedule to join us and present some portions of what I would say the compendium. Just as a reminder, Brad, last week we went through the compendium. We provided Brad those PowerPoints, and I think we've all learned how to spell compendium by now. So thank you, everybody participating last week. Virginia, next slide.
Great. Thanks, Becky. So Kathy, if we can go to the next slide. So a couple of housekeeping things. As you all know, we're using Microsoft Teams Live. All participants are muted. We do have Q&A opened up, so if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. We do not broadcast the questions, so you don't need to continue to put your question and we will get to it. I will also let you know that we are working on an FAQ based on all the questions from all of the Lunch and Learn sessions we've had. One of the reasons we did the compendium last week is because we were getting a lot of questions. So your input is very valuable to us. We do record all Lunch and Learn sessions. Our next call is next Thursday at 12:30 Eastern. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Next slide, Kathy. So Spanish closed captioning is available. If you go in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the gear. You can click on captions, then subtitles. I will tell you that if you have trouble hearing this, you can also click on English subtitles. So please feel free to click on either one. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Becky.
This is a slide just to remind everybody what our shelter decision matrix is. And we committed last week to showing this slide every single time we are doing a Lunch and Learn. For this hurricane season, we will be focused on congregate sheltering. And I think, as everybody knows, sheltering during the COVID-19 pandemic has been a significant challenge, not only in locating facilities, but in locating the workforce. But I have to say, I'm so proud. Had we had an impact in open shelters in Virgin Islands, we resourced people to go there from within the Southeastern Caribbean division, which is awesome. I also believe if we have to open congregate shelters on this tropical storm, we will have the resources from within each of the regions. But I want to reference this and make sure people are aware our focus will be on congregate sheltering. Next slide. The next slide, I just wanted to refresh everybody's memory on looking at our primary risk to mitigate. The principles here are really about workforce safety, keeping our clients safe and our donors safe. So I want everybody, when you really are getting stuck in your decision making around COVID-19 and how we're doing our service delivery, whether it's in prepare, respond, or recovery, go back to the principles. It's like sometimes when we get stuck in our own organization and you really are deliberating of how to make some decision, you go back to the fundamental principles, and I will dare say that will guide you to your answer. I would encourage you to do the same with COVID-19. Go back to your fundamental principles when you're faced with a challenge or a problem, and look to these principles. I think they will help you get to your answer. Next slide.
So Becky, I'll take it from here. So I have the privilege to introduce Brad Kieserman. I think most of you know him, but a few things about him. One is I had the privilege of working for him. I learned a tremendous amount from him. But I want to talk a little bit about some of what Brad has done in the Red Cross. He's obviously led some major disasters. He managed the Florence, Harvey, Irma, Maria, Michael, all the wildfires that have happened, 8 mass shooting events in the United States. So he has incredible experience with us. I think the other thing that he has done is he has made us focused on what our metrics are. And we can then look at our situational awareness of knowing how many people are in shelters, how many people have power outage, how long people have been in shelters. And I think that's moved us along tremendously. Brad is a lawyer, but don't hold that against him. Before he came to the Red Cross, he had worked for the Coast Guard. He also worked in FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security. One of my favorite things that Brad has done, because it's one of my favorite movies, is he worked with the piracy of the U.S. flagged vessel Maersk, Alabama, and how they worked on that. And I think that's pretty cool. So we could probably do a lunch and learn session just on that, Brad. But Brad, we're honored to have you here. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will let you manage the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. I appreciate that. That was a very generous intro, and working with you was and continues to be one of the favorite things that I do in the American Red Cross. You were a fabulous deputy of national operations, and you have consistently and continuously led large operations around the country, and you've just made us better. You make us better every time. Anna, Becky, Kay, Caesar, Kathy, thanks so much for having me today, and everyone, thank you for joining. Hey, let me start here. First of all, I'm a firm believer that you should always begin any conversation about operations with why. What's the why? And sometimes I think it's good to go through one of the exercises that some of the Japanese auto companies use, which is called the 5 whys. And the whole idea behind all of that is to make sure that everybody understands first why we're doing what we're doing, and if we're really doing what we should be doing, right? So let's start with just the why of this year. So obviously, no mystery that what makes this year different than other years is the fact that we're operating in a pandemic. We haven't had to operate in a pandemic a true pandemic for many, many, many years, for probably near a century. The 1918 flu is probably the last time that anyone has really had to operate in the United States in a true pandemic, both responding to the pandemic itself and responding to disasters concurrently. Probably one of the most important lessons that I've learned in the last 5 months of doing this is that, as we know in disasters, sometimes the people who are leading and responding to those disasters come and live in the areas that are affected, right? So I remember, I think it was Irma. So just during Irma, Becky's home was along the track and in the bullseye. And one of the things that we learned during Irma was that you've got to give if the leader's impacted by this, if the team is impacted by the storm, you can't forget about that. You've got to give folks who are affected and impact an opportunity to deal with that situation, to respond to it, to recover from it, and to focus on their personal lives. And so we learned that it makes sense to have other people come in and lead and operate when the leaders in the primary team are affected by the event you're responding to. North Florida, same thing, right? We learned very clearly after Michael that our team was deeply affected by Michael. People lost their homes, people lost their lives, people lost their incomes. So you've got to support and reinforce that team. You can't expect people to both be a responder and be a survivor at the same time, at least not doing both the way they should. So now we have a very different situation. Who is not affected by the pandemic? Who is not at risk from the pandemic? Answer, we're all at risk and we're all affected. We're all in some level survivors of this pandemic. And so we don't have necessarily the luxury of reaching outside of our immediate team to draw others in who are coming from unaffected areas. We're all affected. So why do I start with this? I start with this because we need to give each other grace. First and foremost, please note, I'm not talking about decision making for opening shelters. I'm not talking about PPE. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. And I know you're interested in it, and I'm going to take all your questions. But what I'm interested in and what I want you to focus on is grace. Because we're in for a long, long season. And when the season's over, COVID will still be with us. And we will be responding next March, April, May, and June, I'm sure in SECAR² regions, going through tornadoes and floods, and COVID will still be with us. So when we say this is a marathon, not a sprint, that's a nice saying. We need to act that way. And what that means is we have to give ourselves grace. Grace can look like a number of things. First of all, it can look like just being a bit more patient with each other and with ourselves. Many of us are working remotely and we're working from home. That means there's no barrier between home and work. You can sit at your desk at home 24 hours a day and work, and we'll let you do it, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't. That's not good leadership. So as leaders, we need to make sure that our teams aren't working themselves into the ground. And it's very easy to do that in a virtual environment. For our teams that are on the ground and on the front lines of these responses, we all have an obligation to ensure that we are mitigating as much of the risk as we can. We'll never be able to mitigate all of it. There is no perfect solution. So let me bring us back to grace for a minute. Just have to accept that. There's not going to be a perfect world in which everyone wears the right mask at all the right times, all the time. Not happening. If you go out into your communities, you're going to see it's not happening. Our shelters are a microcosm of our communities. And so we have to deal with the reality of that. And we want to do that in a way that both mitigates risk to our clients and to our workforce and gives grace. And that's going to be a challenge because this whole season is going to be about balance. It's going to be about balance. Now, Anna Trefethen has often said, we have to give ourselves grace because we're going through something that no other people in our generation, whether you're in the Generation X or you're me, whatever generation you're in, our generation, none of us have gone through a true pandemic nationwide, globally, and responding to disasters, and not just responding to disasters, but responding to disasters in a climate that is absolutely heating up and where we are seeing more and more, bigger and bigger, more frequent disasters. I mean, we're on the 9th tropical storm of the season. It's not even August yet. So that is a unique situation and we have to give each other grace. What does that mean? We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have to change policies. We're going to have to deal with things that we didn't contemplate in our plans, because as you've all heard me say, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And we've got to be willing to do that. And part of grace includes humility. So I'll speak personally to that for just a moment. I've said things on calls in the last 5 months that were just flat out wrong. They were even policies I wrote and I forgot what I wrote. I've made mistakes and I'll make more. And I have to remind myself every day that it's absolutely okay for me to admit those mistakes to the people who saw me make them. In fact, it's more than okay, it's essential, because that's about humility and realizing that none of us are perfect. We will all make mistakes, and we'll make more of them if we're tired and we're fatigued. And so it's a good reminder to me that I have to take care of myself. I have to take care of my team. I have to take care of my family, and you're all my team and my family. And so we do have to take care of each other. So I lead with that because when all else fails, when you're confronted with a situation for which you weren't trained for it, or you're not sure what the doctrine says, when all else fails, we do turn, as Becky said, to our fundamental principles. And chief among those principles for us is the humanitarian principle. The notion that we alleviate human suffering in the face of emergencies. That's what we do, and that's no different this year. That's the same as last year. COVID-19 is not going to change our mission, but it is changing the way we do that mission. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. I got an email from somebody this morning, and they said that they were virtually assigned to 489, which is the operation down in Texas. And he said, I have an idea about how we could open up service delivery sites and help more people. We're going to open up service delivery sites. There's nothing in our plan that says we're not. We may open up fewer service sites. We may open up service sites that have different procedures, like drop and step away and let people pick up goods, and then when the table's empty, put more back and drop and step away. But that's just procedure. In the end, the outcome remains the same. And what I would ask all of you to do this year is to keep the outcome the same. The outcome is alleviating human suffering. How we do it may change. I would say we should always be considering changing the way we do things. We should always be a learning organization, and we have had many opportunities to learn in the last 5 years, and definitely in the last 5 months, and we'll have opportunities going forward to learn as well. And we should have the grace and the humility to accept those lessons and make the adaptations we need so that we can achieve the outcomes we must, which is the alleviation of human suffering. So let me move on a little bit here, and I'll take the screen and share a few things. So first of all, let me put this up. I wonder if, and I know I can't talk to you, I guess I can only see what's in chat, but if you don't know what you're looking at a radar screen. A radar is a device that basically sends out a pulse, and the pulse bounces off an object, and it comes back to the radar, and you can see the object on the screen, and you can see how far away the object is, and you can see what the object's doing. What we do at national headquarters is fundamentally about operating a radar. That's what we do. So we're constantly scanning that radar to see what's coming at us, what's going away from us, what are the biggest risks and threats, and what are things we don't have to worry about. On this radar screen that you're seeing, there's a red dot in a box out front here, because the machine, the radar, helps you understand what's getting close to you and what's a threat. And so we're going to be constantly at the radar this season, because there are multiple risks and threats that we're facing coming at us. And there's also a number that aren't coming at us, and we don't need to worry about those. So this is all about figuring out how far the risk is away, how much time you have to make decisions about it, and which risks to prioritize. Because if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So I want to be clear about what's on my radar screen and what my priority is. My priority is the workforce. I didn't say I had 2 priorities. I don't have 3. I have a top 5. I have 1. My priority is the workforce. Why? Because there will be no accomplishment of mission. There will be no achieving our objectives or our desired outcomes. Nothing will happen without the workforce, plain and simple. And so this year, as it should be every year, but even more so because of the risks we face. We have to together focus on protecting our workforce, preserving our workforce, supporting our workforce. Protect, preserve, support. And we all have some responsibilities where that's concerned. And so what I would say that for each of us, right? Trevor Riggin, my boss, one of the most wonderful human beings in the world. So he's not on this call, so I can say that because he's doing a call for me right now on another thing. Trevor said the other day, hey, what this really comes down to is protect yourself, protect the mission. If you protect yourself, you will protect the mission. And so protecting yourself doesn't just mean wearing a mask in every Red Cross facility, which, by the way, is our rule. Everyone entering a Red Cross facility, including Red Cross shelter, is meant to wear a face covering. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's our rule. But that's not the only rule. When you're not on duty and you're out in public, it'd be great if you would wear a mask, because that's going to protect the people around you from any potential infection you might have. And so it'd be even better if everybody else would wear a mask to protect you. Because when I wear a mask, I protect you. When you wear a mask, you protect me. When we both wear a mask, we protect each other, and the risk literally drops down to almost zero. And so we've got to help each other, help our communities adopt these strategies, because that is the way we protect ourselves and protect the mission. Social distance, 6 feet. If we can stay 6 feet apart from each other most of the time, we will decrease the risk and mitigate the risk of either any of us becoming sick, any of our clients becoming sick, any of our family becoming sick. We'll mitigate the risk that the facilities we operate are a source of infection, and then people are afraid to come to where we are, and so they won't come, and so they won't get assistance because they'll be afraid to leave their homes. And the last thing we want to have happen this year, the last thing we want people to do is to stay in the path of a hurricane or a tropical storm or a wildfire or a flood, because they've made the decision that they'd rather accept that risk than the risk of going to a Red Cross shelter. I will tell you right now, we can mitigate nearly every risk you will face in a Red Cross shelter. But if you are someone who lives in the path of a hurricane or a tropical storm or a wildfire, we can't mitigate that risk if you stay there. You are very likely to become either the subject of a search and rescue, or you will be a victim. We can't mitigate those risks. So I'd much rather people come to congregate shelters if that's what we have to do, so that we can mitigate the risk that they will be harmed by an event, and we can certainly mitigate the risk that people will get sick. Which is why, back to the why, which is why our business this year in many ways is no different than our business every year. Communities depend on us to open congregate shelters, and that is our priority. Our priority is to focus on congregate shelter, especially post-impact. Because I suspect, and I think you all know, that there's a reason why we open congregate shelters every year, and it's not because there are so many hotel rooms but people don't choose to go to them. It's because there's frankly not enough non-congregate housing for people who are displaced due to disaster. It's always a problem. It's a problem every year. We have thousands of people in shelters, their homes are destroyed, they can't go home, and there's literally no place for them to go. That's why they're in our shelter. So I don't see that changing this year. In fact, I just see it getting worse, because COVID, as we've learned, is just a compounding disaster. First, it starts with the disease and the spread of the disease, and then it infects our social lives, and then it affects our economy, and then it affects our personal economies. And so, and then it creates stress and fatigue. And so it's just it's literally a compounding disaster. Every month it goes on, it becomes a bit more compounded. But I don't want to make it a bit more complex. There's not that much complexity to this. In the end, it's our role to open congregate shelters if that is what is necessary in a response. Now, it's not always necessary in a response, right? We've identified that for non-tropical, non-hurricane events, that as long as we can assess that the evacuations that are occurring are not so extreme that we would run out of hotel rooms or we'd be unable to manage the flow, in those situations, we're gonna try to find people non-congregate help, and if we can't, we'll open congregate. And generally speaking, if there are 2,500 households or less evacuating in a particular scenario, we can handle the non-congregate load there. We would expect to see about 250 households in a 2,500 household evacuation. We'd expect to see about 250 households present for Red Cross assistance immediately. And in most communities, we can find 250 hotel rooms or dormitory rooms or some combination of that. And that's why we've set that policy up in that decision matrix that Becky showed you, right? So there's a why behind those numbers. The reason we didn't do that in tropical and hurricane evacuations is that typically even a single evacuation zone for a tropical storm or hurricane, even a single evacuation zone is typically going to be more than 2,500 households. And so we've made the decision that in those situations, our primary function is supporting post-impact congregate and meeting our commitments that we've made to our emergency management partners to support evacuation congregate. But back to grace and humility and flexibility. So I'm going to change the screen and show you something else here. Oh, I can't do that. That's not what I'm supposed to do. I do this. So I'm going to show you a different screen. Give me a second to manage my own screens. There we go. All right. So I think you will all, many of you will know what this is. This is RC View, my favorite analytic tool ever. And I'll show you that if I put up a Tropical Storm Hannah event log, you'll see all these dots down here. Well, all these dots are the people who have been calling us for the last 4 days for food, water, and shelter. And so we have opened, we've been able to put some of those folks in hotels, and you'll see those come up here on the screen in a minute. I'll have to take there's so many calls, we've gotten over 600 calls, I'm going to take the calls off for you to see anything. So we have a hotel, we have a couple hotels that are open down there, and we've got about a little over 100 people in hotels. But we've also had to open congregate shelters because some of these communities, there's just no additional hotel space. And so we have hotels open down here, we have some congregate shelter open down here, and this was a tropical, in fact, it was a Category 1 hurricane making landfall. But there were no serious evacuations, and the state came to us and said, can you help us with this? And we evaluated the situation on its facts, and we made a decision to support that request because of the scope and scale. And this is a level 4, and we've been supporting level 4s like this for the entire year. So when we have to make those decisions, the division and NHQ staff will consult and will collaborate, and we'll make a decision if we're going to depart from our plan. But our plan is for a tropical event or a hurricane, we focus our priorities and our resources on post-impact congregate shelter. So another piece of this is, how do you deal with all of those calls? I mean, look at that. And if I showed you the dashboard for it, you'd see it's people asking for food, money, long-term shelter, short-term shelter, water, emergency supplies. And I've had people say to me, well, Brad, we're not sending people to disasters, right? No, that's wrong. We are sending people to disasters. Let me show you. It's not as dramatic when it takes a long time, but we have a little latency in the system, especially since we're got multiple users right now. So what you're going to see here is that we've got over 660 people, almost 670, who are assigned to disaster relief operations right now, and 205 of those 670 are on the ground working for 200, working in Texas or preparing and getting ready in Florida. or responding to the devastating flash flooding that we had in Missouri a couple weeks ago that never hit the news cycle, but has absolutely been an issue. And so in the last 6 months, we've assigned nearly 8,000 people, 8,000 volunteers to the many operations that we've done, including over 1,000 people basically from out of region. So our volunteers are showing up. Presence is a mission. But if we're going to show up, we got to be safe. We've got to be able to mitigate those 4 risks that Becky showed us at the beginning. The risk of infecting ourselves, our clients, or our blood donors, the risk of people perceiving our facilities as being a source of infection and therefore not perceiving them as safe and therefore not availing themselves and getting the help they need. We also have to mitigate the risk of not having sufficient resources. And that's not just about how we fundraise, that's about making smart decisions about when we move resources for disasters. We're making decisions today to load trucks and move resources everywhere from New Jersey all the way over to Louisiana, because we can't be without. And I'll tell you, everything takes longer in COVID. That's why we activated the dock a few days ago, and the dock will likely stay activated. The Disaster Operations Coordination Center will likely stay activated for the rest of the hurricane and wildfire season. I've told my team, plan on a dock Thanksgiving, because that's probably where we're going to be, because everything takes longer. We're dealing with travel restrictions between states, both for materiel and for people. We're dealing with, we really want to encourage everyone who deploys to get tested and let us pay for it and arrange for it before you leave an operation. So if you come and you're going to go to the ground, let us get you tested so at least you know when you go home that you're good. And if we find out that you have the infection, then we will, if you want to go back to your home and quarantine there, your call. If you're not comfortable doing that because of infecting other people in your household, we'll put you up in a hotel near your home for the 14-day or 10-day quarantine period, whatever CDC designates at the time. But that's all about protecting our workforce and protecting our mission. And so we've got to leave time. Yes.
Just a quick question. So we've got people on here that are just learning how to spell Red Cross to people who knew Clara Barton.
Sure.
And there's a question, and I think this is important so we can level set.
Sure.
Can you just please define congregate and non-congregate shelters for the folks?
Absolutely, and I wish I didn't even have to use those words because we confuse them all the time. So congregate sheltering, if you can imagine in your mind a school gymnasium, and people flood into that gymnasium evacuating from a hurricane, and we put cots up and we give people blankets, and we have workers who are making sure they get fed. That's a congregate setting. There's no walls, or if there are, they're little privacy screens. But you may have an individual space sort of marked out on the floor where your family unit is, but there's no wall between you and the other family unit. It's a big open setting. A non-congregate shelter is just another word for a room. So a hotel room, a dormitory room. Sometimes some organizations like the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, some faith-based organizations have camps, and those camps have cabins, and we can put a single family unit in a cabin. So that's non-congregate sheltering. And the reason the distinction matters and also doesn't matter is this. In a congregate setting, there's just more, always, every year, there's more risk of, communicable disease, infection. That's just a normal risk we always have to mitigate through good sanitation procedures and strong healthcare procedures in the shelter. In a time of COVID, as you all know, it's congregate settings that absolutely create more risk than going home to your living room and staying with just your family, where you've contained the risk. So that's what makes it important this year, that distinction between congregate and non-congregate. But here's where the distinction does not matter. If we or the state or the county put people into hotel rooms, those are still displaced people They're there in those hotel rooms not for their luxury or convenience. They're there because they can't go back home. Their neighborhoods may be flooded, their homes may be badly damaged and destroyed, they may have serious mold issues, and they can't safely return home. In a wildfire, it might be because the wildfire is still burning and their homes are still threatened. Same with a hurricane or a flood. And so we have to provide the same services to that displaced population, whether they're in a Best Western room or whether they're in the James R. Brown Middle School gymnasium, because the need is still the same. And I would say to you, in COVID, it's probably even greater because of the compounding nature of the disaster, just because of the more global suffering people are having, especially economically and emotionally. And so while it's important to distinguish between non-congregate and congregate because they help us mitigate some risk, it's also important to understand we provide the same services regardless of where folks are. And that part of that is coordinating that with our government partners and being able to go into a state emergency operations center, a county emergency operations center, have our elected official liaisons who partner with our elected officials and executive officials in government to make sure that those officials have the access to Red Cross information and resources they need to support their communities. And it may mean going and saying, hey, where do you have people in hotels? Where do you have people in dormitories? Can we help you? Can we help you feed there? Do you need health services there? Can we help you with psychological first aid and mental health, spiritual care? Can we help you with the distribution of emergency supplies? Can we help you with casework? We're going to provide those services wherever the displaced population is. So we're going to have to work more closely than ever with our government partners who are our valued partners and who we work closely with every year. The fourth risk we have to mitigate against, just to stay on this theme for a second, is the misalignment with government. Because let's all be honest with each other. Not everybody perceives COVID in the same way. You know, I teach a course at Georgetown University, and part of what I teach is risk perception. And COVID is becoming a case study in risk perception. And so it's not for me in my personal capacity to share how I feel about COVID, how I perceive the risk, how I perceive it comparatively with other risks. But as a professional emergency manager and as the senior operations leader for disaster in the American Red Cross, it is my job to help shape risk perception. And I am firmly of the belief that standing in the way of a hurricane is a less good idea than going to a congregate shelter. And that if at all possible, working with our partners in government, we should all work together to try to find non-congregate solutions for people. It's just safer for everybody. But again, that's part of what we're going to have to do this year is work with governments who don't necessarily share our view of the risk. Some governments will say to us, we don't need to social distance in shelters. People don't need to wear masks. We don't need to do any of those things. And our answer is, respectfully, we appreciate your view. We understand why you see it that way. But the best science we have access to tells us that that is not the best way to protect our workforce and protect our mission. We have to operate all over the country. We have to be able to move people everywhere. And so it's important for us to maintain a consistent risk mitigation posture everywhere. And so it doesn't matter whether it's Des Moines or whether it's Decatur or whether it's Miami Beach. We have to maintain a consistent risk mitigation policy because our people could be anywhere the next day or the day after that. And so we are increasing the amount of space that we are planning for in our emergency shelters and in any evacuation shelters we may open or support. We are requiring masks in all facilities that Red Cross manages or operates. And we have other requirements as well. I think I'll take a minute here, though, to talk about this notion of a requirement and where the flexibility has to lie. We want everyone in a Red Cross facility to wear an appropriate face mask. Let me focus for a minute on the word appropriate. We want everyone coming into a Red Cross facility to have their temperature taken and go through a brief healthcare screening questionnaire, just to make sure that if you're symptomatic, that we're able to put you into an isolation environment with a different level of risk mitigation, which may or may not be in that shelter, but we at least need to know that information. So people who are taking temperatures basically are in an uncontrolled situation, right? You're probably going to be closer than 6 feet. And you don't know whether the person you're dealing with is infected or not because you haven't taken their temperature or done any screening. So the right protection, the right mitigation in that situation is an N95 respirator that reduces significantly any possibility of you inhaling somebody else's particles or them inhaling yours. That is a higher level of protection. In a situation where we can all maintain social distance with people who have been at least screened, a surgical mask, a bandana, a cloth mask, a face mask, all of those should be sufficient protection as long as we're all maintaining social distance. So let's say we have a family and the family is in their cots and their cots are, the proper distance apart that we've established in the policy, and they're ready to go to sleep. Are we going to ask them to sleep with their masks on? We're not. There's no risk. If that family is separate, is socially distanced from the others around it, and they're remaining on their cots, there are no more risk, and it create no more risk than a normal social interaction at distance. And so it won't be comfortable for people to sleep with masks on. And if we try to make people do that, one, it doesn't really add any significant additional protection, but it will add a significant amount of emotional distress. We will encounter people who have a variety of respiratory diseases, face rashes, emotional issues, and they're not going to be able to wear necessarily a surgical mask. But maybe they can wear a face shield. Maybe a cloth mask will be more comfortable. The key is, can we get it over the nose and around the mouth, and that we get the protection that we need? So that's about giving grace. That's about working with our clients and each other to find solutions that protect all of us, and just taking that extra few minutes to say, hey, you understand why you need to wear a mask, right? Because if you wear a mask, you're protecting me. If I wear a mask, I'm protecting you. So it's really important that you protect all of us. We need you to wear that mask. If the person says, well, I really would, it's just really uncomfortable for me. Well, let's see if we can find them something more comfortable. We have a lot of things in inventory. We have face shields. So we have options. And I would encourage everybody not to try to be a scientist or a doctor. We've made some decisions about what's acceptable mitigation. We've done that in consultation with very, very good medical authority. If the science changes, which it has, it's changed from time to time over the course of the pandemic. It's about learning. We're learning more. Scientists and doctors are learning more. So if the risk mitigation changes, then we'll make changes to our inventory as well. But we've got choices for people. Let's help them understand. Now, let's say somebody says, I don't believe this thing about masks, and I could wear one, but I won't. Then you may not be able to stay in our shelter. And that is the hard answer and the hard conversation we're going to have. If we have a school and the school's got multiple rooms in it, and we can keep folks who won't wear masks far, far away from our workforce and other clients who are wearing masks, then we'll try to make those arrangements and create that space. The folks who won't wear masks can stay in the music room, and everybody else is in the gymnasium, and we'll work out the service delivery. Because N95s and some other protection will mitigate the risk for our workforce. We can work through that. But if we don't have that space and people are refusing to wear masks, then we may have to evict them from our shelters. Now, again, this is about being reasonable. For those of you who weren't there for Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Michael or Hurricane Irma or Hurricane Florence or any of the hurricanes that Virginia mentioned when she introduced me, let me tell you, people come flooding into shelters and there's 75, 85, 100 knot winds outside and it's horizontal rain. The humanitarian fundamental principle we have as part of the American Red Cross, that is the principle that has to dominate at that moment. And then you have a hard choice to make, or what looks like maybe a hard choice to make. Do I let this person stay in here who refuses to wear a mask and possibly put others at risk? Or do I tell this person to go out into 100-knot winds, and horizontal rain? You don't put that person out in 100-knot winds and horizontal rain. That creates a life safety situation. We're not doing that. So we will have to find an accommodation for that person until the weather passes, at which point they will either comply with our rules or we will escort them to the door. And if we need law enforcement to help us with that, we'll do that. Because it's about protecting the mission and protecting ourselves. And so it's about balance. It really is about balance. And it's also about perception. And so the ability to help people understand their role in protecting themselves and each other, the time to work through if there's some ability issue that prevents them from wearing a mask, and then the time to deal with that willingness issue and making sure that we give them the consequences and that we're not unreasonable about it. That's going to be important, because the last thing I want to do, whether I have to see a video of it on YouTube or whether I just hear that it happened, because you know what? The most important things we do are when people aren't looking. How you behave when people aren't watching you, that's who you are. And so everybody says to me, oh, last thing, what is a YouTube video going viral of, conflict with a client? No, the last thing I want for us is to do the wrong thing when no one's looking, because then we'll do it when people are looking. I want us to do the right thing when no one's looking. I want us to do the right thing because it's the right thing. And if we do that, we'll always do that. And then I'll live with any YouTube video that comes out. But it is about doing the right thing when nobody's looking. So I think I've gone on long enough about all of those things. I'll take 2 more minutes and I'm going to open this up to questions or take the questions in the chat box. What I'd like to take the 2 more minutes on though real quick is on what's on that radar screen directly in front of us right now, because that goes to the heart of Southeastern Caribbean at this particular moment. So here's what's on that radar screen. Give me just a second to pull it up. By the way, as this is going to come up, you're going to see a lot of other graphics on here until I skinny it down. We're busy all over the country. All these green pins with numbers you see, those are all active disasters all over the country and in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, and in the USVI, and also out in Hawaii, where we've wrapping up our response to Douglas, and large operation down here in Southwest Texas. But there's operations everywhere. And you can see there's hotels open many places across the country where we're responding to flash flooding, multifamily fires, apartment fires, wildfires. That's what all these red dots are. So all that's going on. And then there's this big rain event that's happening in the Tennessee Valley and the Appalachians. And that rain event is really creating a significant risk of flooding for a number of these regions across this area. So all that's happening while this is happening. Let me zoom in. So this is now Tropical Storm Isaias. A somewhat difficult name to pronounce correctly. Some people say Isaiah, some people say other things. The Weather Center sent me a note that says Isaias, so I must stick with that. So you see all these blue pins in Puerto Rico, those are shelters. Puerto Rico opened 48 shelters last night, 48 congregate shelters. And in Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the government runs and operates those shelters in schools, and they use Commonwealth employees to manage and operate those shelters. And so they had about 43 people in 48 shelters all over the island. But they got a lot of wind. They got a lot of rain. About 25% of the island was without power this morning. And so there were impacts. And so right now, even as we speak, Isaias is, depending on whose track you believe, either moving a bit north of Hispaniola, which is the island that contains the Dominican Republic here on the east side, and Haiti here on the west side. And the storm is now forecast. I'm going to pull this precipitation forecast out so it doesn't confuse us. And I'll also pull the storm warnings up. There we go. This storm is now forecast to move up past Hispaniola and then north of Cuba and into Bahamas over the course of Friday during the day and Friday evening. And by sometime Saturday morning, this storm is going to be somewhere between the Florida Keys and Freeport. And don't pay any attention to this cone, and don't pay any attention to this line. The meteorology around Tropical Storm Isaias is very, very complicated. And I'll spare you all the details. The bottom line is, until this system gets across the mountains of the Dominican Republic, or at least passes to the north and gets a little further on up here into the Caribbean, we're not really going to know what it's going to do. And the models are all trying to predict something they weren't designed to predict. This storm did not have a well formulated center until, frankly, very early this morning, and the models are really just catching up with that. And there's a lot of other meteorology that goes into where this storm is going to go that has very little to do with the storm and everything to do with what pressure systems are out here over Bermuda and what pressure systems are in the Midwest here or in the center of the country. So again, this much I can tell you. This storm will approach the United States. It will either be a Category 1 or it will be a tropical storm. I'm pretty confident of that. But whether it goes up the west coast of Florida, straight down the peninsula, off to the east, and then maybe up into the Carolinas or into the Delmarva Peninsula, too early to say. So we have to be ready for all of those contingencies. And so today, at our warehouses around the country, up here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in Union City, Georgia, in St. Louis, Missouri, and over here in Arlington, Texas, we are loading shelter support trailers and 53-foot trailers full of shelter supplies and shelter support supplies, so that when we better understand what the storm is doing, we will not get behind and we'll be able to move from any direction to any location that may possibly be impacted and supplement what each of these regions already has in place, so that we can scale to up to 20,000 people who need congregate shelters in multiple states. And right now, that's our planning assumption, not because that's what's going to happen, but it's because it's what we have to plan for. So that's where we are today. We have relief operations currently established in the state of Florida, and then we've got relief operations that we're establishing up the coast. We've already established operations in Virginia and up in the Delmarva Peninsula, and more will be establishing here over the next few days. So again, this will be a tropical storm or a Category 1 hurricane, might fizzle out and be nothing. We can't afford to be anything less than ready for the highest probability, highest consequence event, because this is the year of the pandemic and people will need us more than ever. And so with that, let me pause and I'll take any questions you all have.
Great, Brad. Thank you so much. This was so helpful. Before we turn to questions for you, Anna, I would like to let you comment on one of the questions that's in there, because I think it goes to who we are as a division. And that question is, division has always said clients first and focus on them. Are we now saying Red Cross people before our clients?
So VA, thank you for asking me that question. And I want to be very clear. It's not an either or, it's an and. And what we have said for our priority, specifically in the COVID environment, that our #1 priority is the health and welfare of our workforce, our donors, and our clients as we deliver our mission. And going back to the SEC leadership expectations, we've been very specific about what we mean when we say put clients, volunteers, and donors first. What we have said is put clients, volunteers, and donors first when making decisions. And that is intended for the support to you as you're having to make very difficult decisions in the field. The winds are blowing and you know everyone's supposed to wear a mask, and someone comes to the door, they refuse to wear a mask, and they have 6 children with them. The intent is you make the best decision and do the right thing when it happens. And that's your cover as a division, that you put the volunteers and the donors and the clients first. So you make a decision to let them in, but you also make a decision to segregate them. I think that's a great example Brad gave that really shows our leadership expectations. The next one is be relentlessly kind to each other. The third is take care of yourself and each other, which goes to the health and welfare of our workforce, our clients, and our donors. The fourth one is support our volunteer workforce. These are our core values. Our key role is to support, empower, and engage volunteers. Our fifth one that we have as a team is be accountable and transparent to yourself and the team. Follow through on our diversity and inclusion commitments as well. So we don't have just one core leadership expectation. We have 5, and then we have the overarching priority, which is, especially in this environment, the number one priority is the health and well-being of our workforce, our clients, our donors, as we deliver our mission. So I hope that answered the question, and I'm happy to chat with anyone if they want to send me a question or a concern about what I shared, because I know it's more complex than one single answer, but I think this is a very complex situation even without COVID. How we respond to disasters, it's always very complex. This is an even more complex year, and I just wanted to be really clear about the intent.
Thank you so much, Anna. So Brad, the first question I want to ask you, it's a little bit out of your wheelhouse. Well, I don't know that there's anything out of your wheelhouse, but this is around training. There are classes that people cannot take because they're only in-person classes to get promoted. And is there someone that's looking at that to change it? The example here was a log facility supervisor, and they need a class, facilities management supervisor simulation. We've had this question in different ways, and so I wanted to see what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks, VA. I think one of the things we've learned intensely over the last 5 or 6 months is that the way that we communicate and the learning solutions that we've developed for our workforce are not optimal. And I'm sure there are people on the call right now rolling their eyes and going, "You just figured that out?" Yeah, we just figured it out. And here's why we figured it out. We figured it out because we're doing more and more communication like this, and it's become very obvious to Trevor and I in particular that the way in which we're attempting to communicate by writing job tools and doctrine and doctrine changes, we've misunderstood the purpose of those things, right? We've told ourselves that that's the tool we're providing the workforce with. The reality of it is not. When we write doctrine and policy, what we're doing is, as headquarters people, we're going through the thinking process that we have to do with our field counterparts to make sure we get the right set of policies together. But the way we should be communicating that to the Red Cross workforce, especially Red Cross disaster volunteers, probably isn't by expecting you to read and memorize I love this book, by the way, so just take it for what. Not expecting you to read and memorize a 180-page book or maybe 480-page books and go through 37 hours of training. That's a barrier to access, and it's not helpful. So going into this season, we focused and prioritized on shelter training for shelter supervisors and for shelter service associates. And we did that because we looked at the risks and we looked at what we thought would be needed of us this summer. And we said to ourselves what I've said to you earlier, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so we made the training of shelter supervisors and shelter service associates our priority going into this season. That is not to say that that any other gap, which is for those who are not familiar with Red Cross lingo, it's basically the position and the function you perform on a disaster relief operation. That's not to say that other positions aren't more or equally as important. It is to say, however, that quite honestly, all of us need to know how to operate in a shelter, because that is the one thing, the absolute one thing the Red Cross must be able to do. Is what communities depend on us to do every night of the year, not just during hurricane season. And so And if you doubt that, let me just tell you, there's no one lined up behind us saying, oh, I'll do it. Don't worry, Red Cross. I've got that sheltering covered. We don't have a peer competitor. No one wants to do this work. When states take on this work, about 3 or 4 days into a disaster, they will typically turn to the Red Cross or a partner and say, can you take this over? We have to get back to what we do. Well, this is what we do. And so we've reduced the amount of time required to become a shelter service associate and the amount of training required by something around 300%. In doing that, one of the things we've heard back is from folks who said, well, when I did it, I had to go through all these classes and all this training and I had to get this experience, and I think it made me be a better shelter service associate. And I respect that view, I do. And I think that is a credible perspective to have. The challenge is when we have as much need as we're seeing this year, and we have as much potential limiting factors to getting workforce in, getting workforce out, workforce health, we have to make some decisions about what's a viable product? What does a viable service associate look like? What does a viable shelter supervisor look like? It may not be the perfect or the best, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so it really is, what do folks absolutely need to do this job safely and effectively and consistent with our values and principles? And that's what we've done with that training. And we've moved all of it to to having it virtual instructor-led training. So that means you can have a virtual experience. We schedule a course and you can take it. There's an instructor online and you can see all that. And we have web-based training, which is not virtual. It's what's called asynchronous, which means you take it when you want and someone talks to you on the screen. Now, those things are not of equal value, and I don't want anybody to think we think they are. We know that people learn better and retain more when they are part of a dialogue in a live interactive session, including live online. In fact, studies indicate that people retain 70%, 2 weeks afterwards, people retain 70% of what they hear and learn if they're actively involved in a dialogue as part of the learning. They retain about 10% of what they learn if all they've done is read a book. So somewhere between that 10 and that 70 is web-based training, and generally the numbers are you retain about 50% of what you learn if you see it and hear it, but you're not actively engaged in discussing it. And so for logistics, for health services, for other gaps, as we move forward, our goal is to get to more virtual instructor-led, more web-based options. We are looking to reduce the amount of time required to qualify in all of those jobs, because we'd like to see more people be able to access those roles and participate and serve their communities. And we don't want to reduce the quality, but I think we believe that just because we've done it a certain way before doesn't necessarily mean that's the best way to keep doing it. And COVID's forced us to face some of that, right? We're doing this call right now on Teams. Well, for the doc, we work in a virtual watch floor. We have a virtual operations center. I actually like it better because I think our collaboration is stronger and better. I think we're talking to each other more. I think it forces us to be more present and more deliberate. So I like it better. I didn't think I'd say that, and I may not like it better in 5 months, which is the other lesson we're learning, is we're not done learning lessons. So just because it feels this way now, it may not feel this way in 5 months from now. We haven't had to do any of this at scale yet. And by at scale, I mean, Category 3 hurricane direct hit on a populated area is different than doing a Category 1 moving through Southwest Texas in an area that's not densely populated. So we haven't had to do any of this at scale. So we will see how all that looks. No plan survives first contact. And on learning, before we go next question, VA, we have an email address I want to just reiterate to everybody. It's lessons learned, LESSONSLEARNED, lessons learned, all just one word, at redcross.org. If you're assigned to an operation or you're working and you say, you know what, I just learned this today. We probably should do this differently. I have an idea for how we can make this better. Or, hey, I saw somebody do this thing that was innovative. I think this is a great practice. I think we should all be doing it. Just 2 or 3 sentences. Just type it into an email. You don't have to put a title on it. Just send it to lessonslearned@redcross.org. We read every one of them. And generally at the midpoint and the end of the season, we collect all those lessons that people have sent in. We organize them basically along sort of what buckets they're in and what they address. And we make decisions on which one to move forward and which ones to hold and which ones to defer. And that is the way we make decisions on how to spend our time and invest our money in training and in learning solutions. And given the changes we want to make in learning solutions, you couldn't have a better time to be making suggestions and sharing with us the lessons you learned. So I would encourage you, lessonslearned@redcross.org. You don't have to wait for the end of disaster. You don't even have to wait for the end of the day. Just type it in there. We will see it, we will use it, and we appreciate it. VA?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And we are putting the, Kathy Scruggs is putting in the email address in the general comments so everyone has it. Brad, there's a question here about shelter workers need both masks and face shields, that the VA clinics do both, hospitals do both. Anna, do you want to add anything to that question before it goes to Brad?
No, I think that's the question, and I thought it was an important one to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Let me actually show you where the guidance comes from, if I can find it quickly enough. But I'll just talk through it while I'm pulling it up. This is not it. The Centers for Disease Control. Let's talk through it. It's probably easier. The Centers for Disease Control and a number of academic institutions have essentially rated the risk of different activities: low, medium, and high. So if you are working in a hospital setting with patients who are symptomatic, you are generally considered to be in a high-risk environment. If you are working in a congregate shelter where masks and social distancing are in use, you are generally considered to be in a medium risk environment. The same as first responders, by the way, who, you see every day: firefighters, law enforcement officers, others who are not in a clinical setting. That is considered to be a medium risk environment. And if you are at home or in public maintaining social distance and wearing a mask, you're considered to be in a low risk setting. And so we are not in a medical setting. And I would say to you that, one, if we had this happen the other night, by the way, so in Texas, one of our partners, government partners, delivered to the door of the shelter a person who had been confirmed positive for COVID, was still symptomatic, and their family would not let them come back home, and their home was destroyed during Hannah. And that was a little shocking, because we would have hoped would have happened is that that person would have been taken to a medical facility for proper care. So that's what we did. We called ambulance services and we had the person taken to a medical facility and checked in, and they got the right care that they needed. So I would say, if we have people who are presenting who are symptomatic, at a minimum, we want to make sure that they're in an isolation portion of the shelter, and the folks who are working in that portion of the shelter should be only health services workers. We've asked all of our partners at the county and state level and a number of our nonprofit partners to help us with that, to show up with us and be able to work at shelters with our health services workers. But if we're providing mass care for people who are symptomatic, then that needs to be happening in an isolation facility, either in the shelter or in another facility, being conducted solely by health services personnel. And those personnel need to be in face shields and masks and gloves, and we have them, and that's what we're providing. If you are in the general population portion of a shelter and people are wearing masks and maintaining social distance, what you need is a mask and social distance. If you're at the door of a shelter and you're taking temperatures, then you should have an N95 on, because that gives you better protection, because it's a somewhat uncontrolled environment. If you're a caseworker and you're going to go cot to cot and you're going to sit on cot to talk to people, you really should have an N95 on, and you should be gloved, because that will help reduce the risk for both you and the client, because there's greater protection with the N95. So that's the reason for the choices that we've made, is that all of those risks have been rated. And if you look at firefighters, talk to others, firefighters are all on the truck with each other and they're wearing masks, because that's what right now the medical advice that we're collectively getting is that is safe, provided certain conditions are met. And so that's what we're working with.
So Brad, quickly, will the Red Cross provide N95 masks?
Yes, we have N95 masks in every region, in every COVID shelter kit, and those masks are meant to be used for either people who are working in isolation portions of shelters, people who are taking temperatures or handling door activity where there's uncontrolled contact, or for caseworkers or food service workers who must be in close contact for some reason. By the way, not every caseworker has to be sitting across the cot from you. There's other ways to do casework, and sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not. So again, make good decisions like Anna said earlier, calculating those risks and working within the policy guidelines we've developed. But if you've got to have an N95, we've resourced those. By the way, N95 is not an item in short supply. We normally give them out as an emergency supply to people who have had wildfires and they're dealing in smoky environments, to people who have mold in their homes. So it's a resource we have. We have a lot of them in inventory, and that's why we were able to very quickly distribute those around the country. So yep, we have N95s, we have gloves, we have face shields, we have surgical masks, and we have a few other bells and whistles that are out there for special need. But we are very well resourced, and our partners have been very generous in saying to us, if you need help with PPE during the course of the year, FEMA, many of our state partners, county partners have said, hey, we've got plenty, we can help you. So nobody should suffer in silence. If anybody thinks they're at a shelter facility or a work site where there's no PPE, you need to bring that to your supervisor's attention immediately. Supervisors, you should be elevating that to DRO headquarters. We can fix that issue, and it shouldn't be an issue we have to fix.
Hey, VA, this is Anna. There's a question in chat that I think is misunderstood, and I want Brad to be able to answer it. In the chat, it says, remember, he said we can't refuse anyone in a shelter. So can you go back and clarify the whole mask issue again and what we actually intended with that answer?
Sure, I'm looking to see if I can see the actual question, because I think that would help, especially since it's about precision of language here.
Yeah, it says, remember, he said that we can't refuse anyone.
So I don't think
I think it's from the one above. So it's if we had to bring any people into a shelter because of a disaster that's occurring and they don't have a mask on, he said that we can't refuse anyone.
Okay,
it's the two questions together, Brad.
I got it. I see it now. Okay, so I think there's three questions that are stacked over. So one says, is there or will there be Red Cross face masks? Yes. I mean, I'm sorry. If you're asking about whether we're going to put logos on masks, not in my wheelhouse and not on my radar. I'm worried about protection, not about branding. And so at this point, I don't anticipate, from a disaster operations perspective, it's not on my radar. I want masks. If I could find, I had my, oh, here's mine. Yeah, mine has, wait, I'll show you. Mine has deer on it. I like deer, so mine has deer on it. And it's a very good mask, and what matters is that you have one. The next question was, in case we have to bring people into a shelter because of a disaster is occurring and they don't have a mask, can we still not wear the mask and shield? So what I said was, and what I want you to, again, this is about thinking through the scenario. I want you to visualize it. Just take a minute and visualize it. There's a hurricane happening outside the door of the shelter. People are coming in. We're going to provide them with masks because we've resourced every region in the country with more than enough masks to open shelters and provide them to our clients and to our teams. And we are, every time we have an incident like Isaias, we're moving more masks and more PPE in, and we're going to leave it there if it's not used because we know that it's going to come up later in the season. So we should have no shortfalls on masks and gloves. And so we're going to have masks in shelters if we're opening them. And so if somebody comes in, what we should be doing is we should be giving them a surgical mask, because that's what we've bought. Give them a surgical mask. They can say, I don't want to wear that, but I have my bandana, I'll put my bandana on, or I have my deer mask, I'll put my deer mask on. Okay, that's fine. Some people may say, I won't wear a mask. Not I can't wear one because I have COPD, Or why do I have to wear one? They'll say, I won't do it. You can't make me, I won't do it. We're not going to send that person into a life-threatening situation in the middle of a hurricane. And I don't think there's any question about that. Because, and I've heard people say to me, well, aren't they threatening our lives if they're in a shelter and not wearing a mask? Not necessarily. If they don't have a temperature and they're not screening positive, there's a possibility they may have it. There's a possibility they don't. If you're wearing a mask and you're staying 6 feet away, your risk should be relatively low. And so, no, they're not really threatening our lives. People have said to me, well, isn't it like bringing a gun in a shelter? No, it's not like bringing a gun in a shelter at all. It's like just making sure that you can stay 6 feet apart from somebody who won't comply with the rules, but is going to face a much more dangerous situation if they go outside. And so what we're saying in that situation is we're not going to put people into a more dangerous situation, but when the weather passes, they either put on a mask or they leave. Because at that point, they have a choice, right? They have a true choice. Comply with our rules or don't stay in our shelter. And we're going to do everything we can to try to accommodate them. We really are. We're going to make every effort to accommodate people who can't wear masks, and we're certainly going to try to persuade people who won't to do that. And if we can create separate spaces for them to be in the building and do that safely, that's a better answer than putting people out on the street. But if we can't do that, then the rule is we wear masks in shelters. That is the rule. So I hope that answers the question.
Great.
Yep.
Thanks. I know we have about 10 minutes more. Brad, we have a couple of questions. How do we navigate the ongoing conflict between law enforcement and our diverse populations? As a shelter is approaching, how do we deal with that inside a shelter? And how do we navigate that for our teams?
What was the, I missed the, is it the ongoing conflict? Was that what you said?
Yes, the ongoing conflict between law enforcement and diverse populations.
Yeah, I'm really glad that question came up because I should have addressed it at the outset. So not only are we dealing with a disaster season with higher than normal risk for landfalling major hurricanes and higher than normal risk for wildfires in the West, we're also dealing with a disaster season where the civil discourse is continuously degenerating into less and less civil discourse, and conflict, as you say here, is arising between people and their governments, between people and law enforcement, some people and some law enforcement who are executing. By the way, let's not paint law enforcement with a brush here, right? So what's happening in places like Portland and Seattle isn't happening in every community in the country. There are many, many communities where you have community-based policing and law enforcement take their role as community leaders and models very seriously. And I would just caution everybody. Everything's not the same everywhere for everyone. And it's that variance that's really, I think, creating distrust and creating more and more hostility. We also cannot ignore the fact that in the world today, in the United States, the African American community has, since the time of the founding of the Republic, been treated as second-class or worse citizens, as property. And that situation, which wasn't resolved by the founders of the country, wasn't really resolved after the Civil War, wasn't resolved after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that situation is coming to a head, as it should. Because none of us are property, all of us are people, and we are all equal, regardless of our gender, our race, our sexual orientation, and I will tell you that whatever your personal views are, for the Red Cross movement across the globe, everyone is welcome and everyone is treated equally. And that is an important part of our value system. And so I just share with you that we have to maintain our independence from and neutrality with all of those issues. Everyone must be welcome where we provide services. and everyone must be welcome to provide services. And so there is conflict today between our clients, some of our workforce, government, law enforcement, and all I can tell you is you have to assess the situation in the community in which you live and serve. It's part of our job as Red Cross leaders to be in communication with our government partners, our law enforcement partners, our public health partners, and be having the conversations, the hard conversations. We've been struggling with this for years with respect to undocumented migrants, because government, generally speaking, in most places won't provide services to non-citizens or non-green card holders. That's not a Red Cross rule. We provide services to anyone who's in need. And so we've often struggled with law enforcement coming into shelters and wanting to round up undocumenteds and, you know, see if there's people subject to search warrant or arrest warrants. We have to create a place of safety. That is what we do. We create a place of safety where people can be treated humanely. And we have to have those conversations with law enforcement and government and make sure they understand our role and what we do. And we can have no tolerance, really. We can have no tolerance for racism, sexism. Just can't. And so those are hard conversations to have. I'm not going to tell you they're easy. Got to have them. And that's the way we have to deal with it, is we got to have them. And got to recognize when you're standing at the door of a shelter and you're a shelter manager, shelter supervisor, one of the hardest jobs in the Red Cross, shelter manager, shelter supervisor, and one of the most important. You have to make split-second decisions about our principles. And that's what you're making decisions about. You're making decisions about how to apply our principles, and never think you're doing anything else, because that's what this is. And so sometimes you have to stand your ground. Sometimes you have to negotiate. Sometimes you have to persuade. Sometimes you just have to say, no, sir, I'm sorry, we can't allow that. I know I'm always the one saying get to yes, but what you're getting to yes on is our principles. We're not going to get to yes on the abuse of our clients, the abuse of our principles. That's not a yes, that's a no.
Great.
So
Yeah, VA, I want to echo that, and I want to say that I've known, with 30 years in the Red Cross and living in the Southeast and Caribbean, I know there have been situations where the law enforcement have said that they are taking over a shelter. And whatever happens, I want you guys to know, elevate, 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 so that we can support you. And we've seen situations like this before. And what we've done when that's been stated is we've asked our volunteers to come out, because we will not support a shelter that is not open to all. So I just want you to know, elevate, elevate, elevate. But in this situation, we would not support a shelter that is not open to the general population.
Thank you. Just a general comment, and then Brad, I've got a couple more questions for you. I know we're nearing the end. So the question that I have, so the comment that I have is, Brad's talked a lot about workforce, and I've seen some comments in here about what about the volunteers? Does this include the volunteers? When Brad uses workforce, it's not just employees, it's not just volunteers, it's the workforce, which encompasses both volunteers and employees. Brad, the question for you is, why are ADs, assistant directors, assigned virtual only? This is unfair to the boots on the ground volunteers that need their guidance.
So I think one, the boots on the ground volunteers need leaders. So we have many leaders who, in fact, ADs are not line supervisors. ADs manage strategy and operations, and that can be done. That can be done from here. I'm doing it now. I'm the national director of operations. I have 6 NADs, and none of them are standing at the relief operations, and most of them wouldn't be normally. What we do have is we have one, and it's really a great question, because it's leadership that's necessary, and leadership. I agree with the questioner. Leaders have to lead from the front, and so on a relief operation, we require that there is a deputy assistant director for response, who is the senior person on the ground, itinerating from shelter to shelter, work site to work site, to make sure that the workforce gets the support and the guidance and the leadership that it needs. But remember, so is every supervisor and manager assigned, right? And so part of what we've learned through the experience in the last 5 months is supervisors and managers are really the people who provide that guidance, support, and leadership. And so what we want to do is support them. So I'll just give you an example of why the tension's there. Somebody else asked a question about a concern about lodging. I will tell you right now that I will do whatever is necessary and pull out every last stop before I say it's okay to open a staff shelter. And just so you all know, directors of relief operations are going to get a note from me later today that was been drafted and ready to go. No one goes in a staff shelter without my personal approval, because that is not where we want to be. And it may need to happen at some point during the year, but we will have exhausted every other possibility. In Texas the other day, we were on the sync call in the afternoon and somebody said, hey, we're going to open up a staff shelter tonight. And I said, why? And they said, well, there's not enough hotel rooms. And Trevor and I literally went on to Google and Googled hotel rooms, and there were plenty. We just weren't using the right channel. And the DRO is busy. They're trying to get service provided. And so we got the headquarters team mobilized. We had rooms for every single responder within 2 hours. Nobody had to go in a staff shelter, and we have plenty of rooms, and we've reserved plenty of rooms, because that's about protecting the workforce. And so I think that that's just a critical piece of this. So if I send an AD in, right, who's going to be on the ground, I really have to ask myself, what's the value added to that AD on the ground? That AD can do all of their work remotely. If that AD wants to be a supervisor, I'll assign him to be a shelter supervisor, and they go run a supervisor, we'll find somebody else to be the AD. But it's really about recognizing what our roles are. And we need to trust our supervisors, trust our managers, empower them, train them. And that's why that deputy AD for response will itinerate, to make sure they have the support that they need, because we trust the leaders that we have. But it's a great question, and I hope the explanation answers the question.
Great, thank you. So Brad, I just want to thank you for presenting. As I hand it off to Anna, I want to give her a question to answer and then to close us out. So the question for you, Anna, will the $118 million in funding that the Red Cross received in June to support blood supply and disaster relief efforts help offset some of the costs we will incur with this potentially increased disaster, activity this year? So I will hand it off to you, Anna, to answer that question and make closing comments. Thank you.
Sure. So the $118 million that we received through an appropriation from Congress was specifically to ensure the nation's blood supply remained able to perform. We have raised funds to cover increased cost around the disaster response. We are also actively fundraising already for this storm that's out there. So we have the funding and the mechanism to fundraise for what we're doing, as well as fundraising for the potential hurricanes 2020 as well. But the $118 million was an appropriation specifically for the blood collection and keeping it able across the country. And Brad, if you want to add anything to that, please do.
Thank you, Anna. Some of the dollars are available based on the grant for offset of costs and generally around PPE. So, and we also have a number of other opportunities this season with FEMA and our partners to offset other costs, both so that we can have additional funds available for response and, if appropriate, additional funds for recovery. And frankly, our partners have been very generous. Very generous.
Yep, absolutely. So Brad, thank you so much for being on this call. I know there were a lot of other questions that we didn't get to. We will do a question and answers the similar to how we've done it before. We will make sure that we get that out to each of you. There are some very specific questions in the chat that are specific to individuals. So just know that you need to go to your leadership to ask those very specific questions, but the more global questions that are related to how we respond, we will put in a FAQ and get back out to you. Thank you guys for all you have done and are going to do going forward. And just remember, our #1 priority is the health and welfare of our workforce clients and our blood donors while we deliver the mission. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.